Welcome back to Crowned Black Heroes, where we uncover the extraordinary stories of triumph that history tried to bury. Today, I'm going to tell you about a man whose father was born in Africa, enslaved in America, and died in chains. A man who grew up watching his father work impossible hours to buy his own freedom, only to die exhausted before he could truly enjoy that freedom. A man who took his father's name, rejected the name of the family that once owned them, and built an empire so vast that he became wealthier than almost any white person in his entire state. This man owned a fleet of ships that sailed across the Atlantic. He owned hundreds of acres of land. He met with presidents. He employed dozens of black workers at a time when most black people couldn't find any work at all. And he did all of this in the late 1700s and early 1800s, in an America that was still actively enslaving millions of black people, in a society that told him at every turn that he was inferior and had no right to aspire to anything beyond servitude. This is the story of Paul Cuffe, the son of a slave who became one of the richest men in America, and how his success challenged everything white America believed about race, capability, and destiny. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you these incredible untold stories every single week. And if this story inspires you, if it makes you realize how much brilliance and determination it took for black people to succeed in a system designed to crush them, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think. Now let me tell you about the man who built an empire from nothing and proved that freedom and wealth could belong to anyone with the courage to claim them. We begin not with Paul Cuffe, but with his father, a man whose African name was Kofi, but who was forced to take the name Cuffe Slocum when he was enslaved. Kofi was born in West Africa, probably in what is now Ghana, sometime around 1705. The exact details of his early life are lost to history, swallowed by the brutal machinery of the slave trade. What we know is that Kofi was captured, probably as a young man, and transported across the Atlantic in the hellish conditions of a slave ship. He survived the Middle Passage, which killed approximately 15 to 25% of captives, and was sold in Massachusetts to a Quaker family named Slocum. Ebenezer Slocum became Kofi's legal owner, and Kofi, now called Cuffe, became one of Slocum's slaves. Massachusetts in the early 1700s still practiced slavery, though it was less central to the economy than in southern plantation colonies. Enslaved people in Massachusetts worked on farms, in households, and artisan trades. The conditions were perhaps marginally less brutal than on southern plantations, but slavery is slavery. Kofi was property. He could be sold, beaten, worked, without compensation, denied all rights. But Kofi had something that even slavery couldn't destroy, an iron determination to be free. Over the years, Kofi worked every moment he could, doing extra jobs, saving every penny. The Slocum family, being Quakers, had some moral qualms about slavery, and like some Quaker slaveholders, they eventually agreed to allow Kofi to purchase his own freedom. Think about that for a moment. Kofi had to buy himself, as if he were a horse or a piece of furniture. He had to pay money to legally own his own body, his own life. The price was steep, probably several years' worth of wages. But in 1745, after working for decades as a slave, Kofi paid the money and became a free man. He was approximately 40 years old. Most of his life had been spent in bondage, but now he was free. And what does Kofi do with his freedom? He continues working, continues saving, and eventually purchases a farm in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. He marries Ruth Moses, a Native American woman from the Wampanoag tribe. Together they have 10 children, one of whom is named Paul, born on January 17, 1759. Paul Cuffe, which will become his chosen name, is born into freedom because his father purchased it with decades of labor and sacrifice. This fact shapes everything about Paul's life. He grows up knowing that his father was once enslaved, knowing the price of freedom, understanding that what they have could be taken away at any moment in a society built on racial oppression. When Paul is 13 years old in 1772, his father Kofi dies. Kofi worked himself to death, essentially buying his freedom and then building a life for his family. He leaves behind 116 acres of farmland and a family that is legally free, but living in a society that despises them for the color of their skin. Paul and his siblings inherit the farm, but they also inherit something more important: their father's determination, his work ethic, his absolute refusal to accept the limitations that society tried to impose. Paul could have stayed on the farm, working the land, living a quiet life. But Paul has bigger dreams. At 14 years old, just a year after his father's death, Paul goes to sea. The maritime industry is one of the few places where free black men can find work in colonial Massachusetts. Ships need crew, and captains are often willing to hire anyone who can do the work, regardless of race. Paul signs on as a crew member on a whaling ship. Whaling in the 1770s is brutal, dangerous work. Ships spend months or even years at sea, hunting whales in the Atlantic and eventually in the Pacific. The work is physically exhausting, the conditions are terrible, and the danger of injury or death is constant. But it pays, and it offers Paul something invaluable: the chance to learn navigation, seamanship, and the business of maritime trade. Paul makes several whaling voyages. As a teenager, learning everything he can about ships and the sea. But his maritime career is interrupted by the American Revolution. In 1776, when Paul is just 17, he's captured by British forces while at sea. The British are stopping American ships, seizing cargo, and sometimes impressing sailors into service in the Royal Navy. Paul spends 3 months as a British prisoner before being released. This experience could have broken his spirit, but instead it seems to harden his determination. He returns to Massachusetts even more committed to building his own success, to being beholden to no one, to achieving the kind of independence and security that can't be taken away by wars or political upheaval. After the Revolution, Paul and his brother David begin to build their own maritime business. They're teenagers, barely 20 years old, and they're trying to compete in an industry dominated by established white merchants with capital, connections, and generations of experience. Paul and David start small, building a small open boat and using it for coastal trading. They buy goods in one port and sell them in another, making small profits on each voyage. It's grueling work. They're sailing in all weather, dealing with difficult customers, competing against larger, better equipped vessels. But they're building something, learning the business, establishing relationships. Then in 1780, something happens that reveals Paul Cuff's character and his understanding of justice. Massachusetts imposes a tax on all property owners, including Paul and his brother. But Massachusetts law does not allow free black men to vote. They can be taxed, can be required to support the government, but they have no say in how the government operates or how their tax money is spent. This is taxation without representation, the very principle that white colonists had just fought a war over. Paul Cuff decides he's not going to accept this injustice silently. At age 21, Paul, his brother, and 5 other free black men refuse to pay their taxes. They're arrested and briefly jailed, but Paul uses the arrest as an opportunity. He and his brother petition the Massachusetts legislature, arguing that if free black men are required to pay taxes, they must be given the right to vote. Their petition is eloquent and powerful, making the case that the same principles of representation and natural rights that justified the revolution applied to black citizens as well. The petition doesn't immediately succeed in gaining voting rights, but it does gain attention. Paul Cuff, still in his early 20s, is establishing himself as someone who will not accept second-class citizenship, who will demand his rights even when demanding them is dangerous. Throughout the 1780s, Paul continues to build his maritime business. He and his brother eventually part ways professionally, and Paul begins operating independently. He saves every penny he can, reinvesting profits into larger vessels and more ambitious trading voyages. By 1787, when Paul is 28, he has enough capital to build a larger ship. This requires not just money, but also credit. And getting credit as a black man in 1780s Massachusetts is nearly impossible. Banks don't want to lend to black businessmen. White merchants see Paul as a competitor and have no interest in helping him succeed. But Paul has built a reputation for honesty, for delivering on his commitments, for working harder than anyone else. He finds investors, probably including some Quakers who are sympathetic to free black advancement, and he builds his ship. Now, Paul can engage in more profitable long-distance trading, sailing down the coast to the Chesapeake, up to Maine, eventually even to the Caribbean. Every voyage is a risk. Storms can sink ships. Pirates can seize cargo. Markets can shift, turning profitable goods into losses. But Paul is careful, strategic, and willing to work harder than any of his competitors. His business grows. In 1773, Paul marries Alice Paquette, a Native American woman from the Wampanoag tribe. Like his mother, they have several children, and Paul is determined that his children will have opportunities he never had. Even as he's building his business, Paul is thinking about education, about community, about creating institutions that will support black advancement. By the 1790s, Paul Cuff is becoming wealthy by any standard. He owns multiple ships, the largest being a vessel called the Alpher that displaces over 260 tons, making it one of the larger merchant vessels operating out of New England. He owns the Traveler, the Hero, and eventually a fleet of vessels that sail up and down the American coast and across the Atlantic to England and Africa. His ships are remarkable for another reason. They're crewed and captained entirely by black sailors. In an era when most black sailors work under white captains and white authority, Paul's ships are black-owned, black-captained, and black-crewed. This is revolutionary. Paul is not just succeeding within the existing system. He's creating an alternative economic structure where black men can work with dignity, earn fair wages, and advance based on their abilities. Paul also begins investing in land. In 1797, he purchases a farm for $3,500, an enormous sum at the time. He continues to acquire property, eventually owning over 300 acres in Westport, Massachusetts, including waterfront land where he builds a shipyard. He constructs a mill on his property. He's not just a ship captain and merchant anymore. He's becoming a full-scale entrepreneur, diversifying his investments, building wealth that can be passed down to his children. By the early 1800s, Paul Cuff is almost certainly the wealthiest black man in the United States. His ships sail across the Atlantic. He employs dozens of black workers. He owns more land than most white farmers. And he's doing all of this in a country that still legally enslaves hundreds of thousands of black people. Think about that contradiction. While Paul is building an empire, there are black people in Virginia, in South Carolina, and Georgia who are being bought and sold like animals, who have no rights, who can be worked to death or beaten or raped with no legal recourse. Paul's success exists in this morally grotesque context, and he's acutely aware of it. His wealth is not just personal achievement. It's a political statement. a challenge to the entire ideology of white supremacy that justifies slavery. Paul becomes increasingly involved in activism and philanthropy. He's a devout Quaker, having joined the Society of Friends, and Quaker principles of equality and social justice align with his own beliefs. In 1811, Paul donates half their money needed to build a new Quaker meeting house in Westport. This is not a token donation. This is a massive financial contribution that makes him one of the primary benefactors of the meeting. He's also concerned about education for Black children. In most of Massachusetts, schools are segregated or simply refuse to admit Black students. Paul uses his wealth and influence to establish a school on his property that admits both Black and white children, making it one of the first racially integrated schools in the United States. This is decades before the Civil War, decades before Brown versus Board of Education. Paul Cuff is creating integrated education because he understands that knowledge is power and that Black children deserve the same educational opportunities as white children. The school is controversial. Some white parents don't want their children learning alongside Black children. But Paul's status as a wealthy, respected member of the community gives him the leverage to make it happen. His money, his reputation, his undeniable success make it difficult for white society to simply dismiss him the way they dismiss most Black people. But Paul is thinking beyond America. He's thinking about Africa and about the millions of Black people in America who are enslaved or who, even if free, face constant discrimination and limited opportunities. Paul becomes interested in the idea of Black Americans returning to Africa, not as a deportation scheme imposed by white people, but as a voluntary movement where Black people could build their own nation, free from white oppression, able to develop their own institutions and economy. This idea, often called the Back to Africa movement, has a complicated history. Later, it will be championed by Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. But Paul Cuff is one of its earliest and most significant advocates. In 1811, Paul undertakes an extraordinary voyage. He sails his ship, the Traveler, to Sierra Leone in West Africa. Sierra Leone had been established by the British as a colony for freed slaves, and there's a small community of Black Americans and Black British people living there. Paul wants to see the colony for himself, to understand its potential, to explore the possibility of establishing trade networks between Africa and America that could be controlled by Black merchants rather than white ones. The voyage is remarkable not just for its distance, thousands of miles across the Atlantic, but for its purpose. Paul is thinking about Black self-determination, about creating economic and political structures that serve Black interests. Paul spends several months in Sierra Leone, meeting with community leaders, assessing the agricultural and commercial potential of the region, and beginning to lay groundwork for future emigration and trade. When he returns to America, he's even more committed to the idea. He begins organizing and financing a return voyage, planning to transport Black American families who want to emigrate to Sierra Leone, where they can own land, govern themselves, and live free from American racism. But the War of 1812 interrupts Paul's plans. The United States and Britain go to war again, and transatlantic shipping becomes extremely dangerous. British warships are seizing American vessels, and the risk of losing his ship and cargo is too high. Paul waits out the war, using the time to continue building support for African colonization among free Black communities in the North. After the war ends in 1815, Paul finally undertakes his planned emigration voyage. In 1815 and 1816, Paul sails to Sierra Leone with 38 Black American emigrants, families who have sold everything they own in America to start new lives in Africa. Paul pays for the voyage himself, absorbing the enormous cost of transporting people across the Atlantic. This is not a business venture. This is philanthropy on a massive scale. Paul is using his wealth to give other Black people opportunities for true freedom and self-determination. The voyage is successful. The emigrants establish themselves in Sierra Leone, and Paul returns to America, planning future voyages and continuing to advocate for African emigration. But Paul's health is failing. Years of sailing in all weather, of physical labor, of constant stress and work have taken their toll. He's not yet 60 years old, but he's exhausted. In 1817, just 2 years after his triumphant voyage to Sierra Leone, Paul Cuff dies at his home in Westport, Massachusetts, on September 7th. He's 58 years old. His funeral is attended by both Black and white community members, a testament to the respect he commanded across racial lines. He's buried in the Quaker cemetery in Westport. His estate, which includes ships, land, buildings, and various business interests, is substantial. He's one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, regardless of race. His death is noted in newspapers, and in Quaker circles, he's mourned as a man of principle and vision. But what happens after Paul's death reveals the persistent reality of racism even in the face of undeniable Black achievement. Paul's business gradually declines. His sons try to maintain the shipping enterprise, but they face obstacles their father dealt with, but could occasionally overcome through sheer force of personality and reputation. Banks are less willing to extend credit. White merchants undercut their prices. The integrated school Paul founded eventually resegregates as white families withdraw their children. Within a generation, much of what Paul built has been diminished or dismantled. And then, most painfully, Paul Cuff himself is largely forgotten. Through the 19th century and into the 20th, Paul's name disappears from mainstream American history. When textbooks discuss the early American Republic, they mention founding fathers and frontiersmen and inventors, almost all of them white. The story of American commerce and maritime trade is told without mentioning the Black ship captain who built a transatlantic trading empire. The history of the abolitionist movement and Black activism is discussed without adequate recognition of Paul's pioneering work. Even the Back to Africa movement is often associated with later figures like Marcus Garvey, with Paul's foundational work minimized or forgotten. This erasure is deliberate. Paul Cuff's life story is too threatening to the racial narratives that white America wants to maintain. If a Black man born just 14 years before the Declaration of Independence, whose father was enslaved, could become wealthier than almost any white person in his state, could build a shipping empire, could meet with presidents, could establish schools and fund churches and organize international immigration movements, then what excuse is there for the poverty and oppression of Black Americans? If Paul Cuff could succeed to that degree in the early 1800s, despite facing enormous racial barriers, then the racist claim that Black people are naturally inferior or incapable becomes absurd. So, the easiest thing for white historians to do is simply not talk about Paul Cuff, to exclude him from the narrative, to pretend he didn't exist. This erasure continues for over a century. By the mid-1900s, very few Americans, even Black Americans, know who Paul Cuff was. His name isn't taught in schools. His ships aren't memorialized. His grave in Westport is maintained by the Quaker community, but visited by almost no one. Then slowly, beginning in the late 20th century, historians begin to recover Paul's story. Academic researchers dig into maritime records, business documents, Quaker archives, and they reconstruct the life of this extraordinary man. Books are written. Papers are published. Paul Cuff begins to receive the recognition he deserves, though still primarily in academic circles rather than in popular consciousness. In 1994, the United States Postal Service issues a commemorative stamp featuring Paul Cuff as part of their Black Heritage Series. In 2010, The Cuff family homestead in Westport is designated a National Historic Landmark. Schools in Massachusetts are named after him. There are now scholarships and awards given in his name. But even with this growing recognition, Paul Cuff remains largely unknown to most Americans. Ask a random person on the street to name a Black historical figure, and they'll probably say Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, or maybe Frederick Douglass. Almost no one will say Paul Cuff, despite the fact that his achievements were extraordinary for any era, but especially remarkable for the early 1800s. So why does Paul Cuff's story matter today? Why should we care about a man who died over 200 years ago? There are several reasons. First, Paul's life demonstrates that Black excellence and achievement are not new phenomena, not recent developments that only became possible after the Civil Rights Movement. Black people were building businesses, accumulating wealth, demonstrating intelligence and capability from the earliest days of American history. Paul Cuff was succeeding at the highest levels in the late 1700s and early 1800s, proving that the limitations placed on Black people were never about inherent capability, but always about systemic oppression and racial barriers. Second, Paul's story reveals the extraordinary obstacles that Black people had to overcome to achieve anything. Think about what Paul accomplished. He went from being the son of a former slave to becoming one of the richest men in Massachusetts. But to do that, he had to work harder than any white competitor. He had to overcome discrimination in access to credit, in business relationships, in legal protections. He had to be not just good, but exceptional. Because mediocre white businessmen got opportunities and second chances that exceptional Black businessmen were denied. Every step of Paul's success required 10 times the effort that a white person in the same position would need. That's what systemic racism means. Not that success is impossible, but that it requires superhuman effort and some amount of luck. Third, Paul's activism and his vision for Black self-determination remain relevant. Paul understood something fundamental. Individual success, while important, is not enough if the broader community remains oppressed. Paul could have simply enjoyed his wealth, lived comfortably, and ignored the plight of other Black people. Instead, he used his resources and his platform to advocate for change, to create opportunities for others, to imagine and work toward a future where Black people could live with true freedom and dignity. His establishment of integrated schools, his employment of Black workers, his financing of emigration to Africa, these were all efforts to lift up the broader Black community, not just himself. That's true leadership and true commitment to justice. Fourth, Paul's complicated relationship with the Back to Africa movement offers important lessons about Black political thought and the question of whether equality is achievable within American society. Why or whether Black people need separate institutions and spaces. Paul believed, based on his experience of persistent racism despite his enormous success, that Black people might never achieve true equality in America, and that establishing a Black-governed nation in Africa might be the only path to real freedom. This idea has been controversial throughout Black history. Many Black leaders have argued that the fight should be for equality within America, not for separation or immigration. But Paul's perspective, born from lived experience of racism at the highest levels of achievement, demands to be taken seriously. He wasn't advocating for deportation or for giving up on America. He was asking whether Black people deserve spaces where they could exercise full self-determination without white interference or oppression. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Paul Cuff's erasure from history demonstrates how historical narratives are constructed and who gets to be remembered. Paul's story wasn't lost because documentation didn't exist. Maritime records, business, ledgers, Quaker archives, newspaper accounts, all of this survived. Paul's story was lost because historians chose not to tell it, because textbook publishers chose not to include it, because the narrative of American success and entrepreneurship was constructed as a white narrative and Black achievement was seen as irrelevant or threatening to that narrative. Recovering Paul's story means interrogating how history is written, whose stories are told, and what purposes those narratives serve. It means recognizing that the history we're taught in school is not objective truth, but a carefully curated selection that reflects the biases and interests of those who control education and cultural institutions. And it means committing to telling more complete, honest stories that include the full diversity of American achievement and experience. When we teach children about the early American Republic, about commerce and shipping and entrepreneurship, we should teach them about Paul Cuff. When we discuss Black history, we shouldn't start with slavery and jump to the civil rights movement, skipping over centuries of Black achievement, activism, and community building. Paul Cuff and people like him were building institutions, accumulating wealth, advocating for justice throughout American history. Their stories need to be told. There's one more dimension to Paul's story that deserves attention: the example he set for his own family and community. Paul's children grew up watching their father build an empire, watching him navigate racism with dignity and strategic intelligence, watching him use his wealth for the benefit of others. That example shaped them and shaped the Cuff family for generations. Paul's descendants include educators, activists, and business people who continued his legacy of service and achievement. The impact of one person's excellence and integrity ripples forward through time, affecting not just immediate family, but entire communities. Every young Black person in Westport and the surrounding area who saw Paul Cuff ships in the harbor, who worked on his vessels or in his shipyard, who attended the school he founded, was given a vision of what was possible. Paul expanded the realm of possibility for everyone who knew him. That's the power of visible success and representation. Paul's story is ultimately a story about freedom, about what it means and what it costs. Paul's father bought his freedom with decades of labor. Paul inherited that freedom and built on it, creating not just wealth, but agency, dignity, and the power to shape his own destiny and the destinies of others. He understood that freedom is not just a legal status, but an economic and social condition. A free person who can't own property, who can't get credit, who can't educate their children, who has no political voice, is not truly free. Paul fought for economic freedom through his business success. He fought for educational freedom through his school. He fought for political freedom through his activism. And he fought for the freedom of self-determination through his support for African emigration. In every dimension of life, Paul was expanding freedom for himself and for his community. Before I close, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're Paul Cuff in 1790, 31 years old, standing on the deck of your first substantial ship. You're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, the same ocean that brought your father in chains from Africa to America. Your father died just 18 years ago, worn out from working to buy the freedom that should have been his birthright. You're now a ship captain and merchant, competing against white businessmen who have every advantage of capital, credit, and racial privilege. Most of society tells you that you're inferior, that you should be grateful for any opportunities you get, that you should know your place. What do? Do you play it safe, accept a limited success, try not to, red and white sensibilities? Or do you go all in, build the biggest business you can, employ as many Black workers as possible, establish integrated schools, challenge unjust laws, and use your success as a platform to advocate for broader Black freedom? Paul Cuff chose the second path. He didn't just succeed. He succeeded spectacularly, unapologetically, in a way that challenged every racist assumption of his error. He built an empire, rejected the enslaver's surname, took his father's African name, and became richer than the family that once owned his father. That's not just success. That's poetic justice. That's revolution through excellence. If this story inspired you, if it made you angry that Paul Cuffe's name isn't taught in every American history class, if it made you think about the countless other Black achievers who have been erased from history, then I need you to act right now. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who need to hear Paul Cuffe's story. Subscribe to Crown Black Heroes and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you these powerful stories of Black excellence that shaped American history. And drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about Paul Cuffe. Had you heard of him before this video? What other early Black entrepreneurs and activists do you want to learn about? How do we make sure these stories become part of mainstream historical education rather than being relegated to the margins? Let's build a community committed to recovering and celebrating the full truth of Black achievement in American history. Share this video everywhere. Make sure Paul Cuffe's name becomes known. Make sure his example of excellence, integrity, and commitment to community uplift is recognized and celebrated. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for caring about historical truth and for honoring the legacy of a man who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose. Paul Cuffe deserves to be remembered as one of the great American entrepreneurs, as a pioneer of Black activism, as a visionary who imagined Black freedom and self-determination decades before the Civil War. His story is not just about individual success. It's about what becomes possible when Black people have access to opportunities, when they can build wealth and use the wealth to create institutions that serve their communities. Share his story, honor his legacy, and join me next time as we uncover another incredible story of Black excellence that history tried to erase. Until then, stay inspired, stay committed to justice, and keep fighting to ensure that everyone's contributions to American history are recognized and sealed. Braided peace.